All right, so folks who are sitting here joining the call, seeing us sitting in silence, we're just waiting for more of the audience to enter the room, and then we'll get started. So you are in the right place. We will get started in about 40 seconds. All right, so I think we're going to get started this morning. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm Laura Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our webinar today, looking at U.S. expert perspectives on the Israel-UAE deal. This webinar is part 2 of a 2-part series co-organized by the Middle East Institute and the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and co-moderated by myself and my colleague Khaled Al-Gindi, who is a senior fellow and director of the program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli affairs at the Middle East Institute. If you missed yesterday's webinar featuring Israeli and Palestinian experts, you can find a video for that on both of our websites. So for today's event, some quick context. Everyone, I'm sure, knows this. On August 13th, President Trump announced that Israel and the UAE had agreed to, quote, finalize a historical peace agreement that would involve full normalization of relations between the two nations. The president said, quote, not since the Israel-Jordan peace treaty was signed more than 25 years ago has so much progress been made towards peace in the Middle East. So to discuss that statement and what it means and whether it's true and all the rest, we have our webinar today. So over to you, Khaled.
Thanks, Laura. To help us shed light on this important topic, we have a really stellar group of experts with us. I'll introduce them here briefly. You've got longer bios for each of the panelists on both the MEI and FMEP websites for today's event. And we'll be putting into the chat box the Twitter handles of all our expert panelists. If you want to follow them, please, I encourage you all to do so. Going alphabetically, starting with, first we have Stephen Cook, who is a senior fellow for the Middle East and Africa at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's an expert on Arab and Turkish politics, as well as broader US Middle East policy, and is the author of several books, including False Dawn, Protest, Democracy, and Violence in the New Middle East. Second, we have Annelle Sheline, who is a senior research fellow for the Middle East at the newly established Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and a non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute Center for the Middle East. Her research focuses on religious authority in the Middle East, specifically the intersection of religious and national identities in the Arab monarchies. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. James Zogby, who is Managing Director of Zogby Research Services, specializing in research and communications. He's also the founder and president of the Arab American Institute, a Washington, D.C. based organization that serves as the political and policy research arm of the Arab American community.
Great. So some quick housekeeping before we get started. The format for today's webinar, and folks who've attended our webinars before will recognize this, it will be a moderator-led discussion with the panelists. So Khaled and I will be asking questions, but in addition to our own questions, we welcome audience questions, which can be submitted via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to submit questions at any time throughout the panel. We'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to factor your questions into the discussion. Also, please note that this webinar is being live webcast and recorded, and recording will be posted online immediately after it ends. Finally, if you have any technical problems, let us know using the chat function, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please don't use the chat function for questions because we may not see them. The chat function is actually being managed by a colleague who is not on the call, not visible on the call. So with that, we will begin.
Thanks, Laura. So let's go ahead and start our first round of questions. Annelle, let me begin with you. In one of your recent articles, you argued that the UAE's main motivation was not purely geopolitical. We all know about the threat of Iran. And of course, there's been a lot said about the US F-35s and so on. But you argue that it was also ideological in many ways. Could you explain that for us? And also, how do you see the shift in regional attitudes in the Arab Gulf states with regard to Israel?
Yeah, thanks so much. Really happy to be here. And thanks to MEI and Foundation for Middle East Peace for convening this. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that the UAE has a masterful approach to public relations. My upcoming book examines the strategic use of religious narratives by Arab autocrats, especially the notion of so-called moderate Islam. And this notion of moderation is one that the UAE has deployed very effectively. Some regional observers have said that perhaps the UAE now feels isolated because other states that were considered likely to fall into place with normalization, such as Sudan, Bahrain, and Oman, have not done so, despite Secretary Pompeo's efforts to get them to agree to that on his recent trip. And some have said, oh, well, maybe the UAE now is feeling isolated. And I would argue instead that the UAE, in fact, benefits from being seen as sort of unique in this regard, that it is uniquely tolerant. We might remember the Roman Catholic Pope visiting the UAE last year. They have welcomed other faiths to practice openly in the UAE in a way that is not possible in other countries in the Gulf, especially like Saudi Arabia. And now they are uniquely willing to normalize relations with Israel. So this plays into their sort of narrative that they are this sort of unique actor in the region that is a particularly useful partner for the United States, for example. And at the same time that they do allow for religious tolerance, they do not allow for other so-called Western values, democracy, free expression. It's still very much a very tightly controlled society that lacks any kind of political representation. But the Emiratis know that on the issue of Israel, that matters a lot more, especially either for a second Trump administration or for a Biden administration, that they're going to be much more concerned with the fact that they're the first Arab country in decades to normalize relations with Israel. And so it really doesn't matter from the UAE's perspective that they're out there alone. And it might even, from their perspective, be preferable. In terms of the question of the shift in regional attitudes, my esteemed co-panelist, Dr. Zogby, had a recent piece for Responsible Statecraft where he points out that attitudes across the Arab world have undergone a dramatic change in the past few years. But I would argue that even his own polling shows that the shift in opinion is not actually away from the salience of Palestine, but is in fact a pragmatic acknowledgement on the part of Arab publics that doing nothing in Palestine is in fact detrimental to the Palestinian cause as more and more land is taken by settlers. So therefore, the shift in public opinion is more this acknowledgement that the status quo is hurting Palestinians. And so anything that changes, if it can help the Palestinian cause, they are in favor of.
Thanks for that. Turning now to Stephen, in your latest foreign policy piece, and I'm going to paraphrase here, you argue that reactions to the UAE-Israel deal were overblown on both sides. It wasn't the disaster that its critics alleged, and also this historic step towards peace that many of its proponents claimed. You do acknowledge that the deal did in fact sideline the Palestinian issue, but you also argue that that there might have been an opportunity there, however slim, to engage constructively. Could you describe that for us in more detail? You're muted.
After all those directions to unmute myself, I totally forgot. It's just because I was very excited to answer the question. Anyway, thanks, Khaled. Thanks, Lara. It's a great pleasure to be with Jim and Annelle as well on this. Look, I think that one would imagine that, since the last announcement of normalization between two Arab countries was way back in 1994, that the announcement on August 13th that the Israelis and the Emiratis were normalizing would kind of stir something in people. And I think really it's kind of a collective shrug. I mean, this is just a step in what has been an arc between the Emiratis and the Israelis. They might as well, they have had relations that are kind of everything but normalization up until this point. And so I don't think it's not like obviously the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, which is a complete paradigm shift in the region. Jordan and Israel was a monumental treaty for a whole separate set of other issues, even though those two countries had a long history of relations. This is something that it strikes me that was in the cards, has been in the cards for quite some time. I do think, however, that all the cheerleaders for it are saying, oh, this is a great deal and so on and so forth. And it's very good for the Israelis and the Emiratis for a variety of political, diplomatic, and strategic reasons. But I think that there was an element to the cheerleaders of it who said, hey, well, look, it takes annexation off of the table. And I think it requires a certain suspension of memory to say that. It just really takes the Israelis back to where Prime Minister Netanyahu was in September 2019 when he first raised the issue of formal annexation. And so Netanyahu has not, and his government has not indicated as a result of the agreement, any greater interest in negotiating a deal with the Palestinians. By the same token, it has laid down a marker for the Israelis. The Emirati relationship with them, for them, is very, very important. So even if Netanyahu and the government aren't showing much interest at the moment, there is this at least pause in a process that was going along. And let me just say as an aside, I do think, and I agree, that the status quo definitely serves annexationist interests. I have argued in the past that the status quo is essentially annexation by another name. But this pause, this marker, if the critics of the agreement had sought to engage on this issue in a more constructive way rather than criticizing this deal, there may have been an opportunity to kind of turn the tables on the Israelis, the Trump administration, and even the Emiratis to get people to actually significantly think about it. I think the Palestinian Authority made a huge error here. I think others have made a huge error in not taking up the narrative that this takes annexation off the table and try to engage constructively. It would have been better for the Palestinians had the Palestinian leadership said, okay, this is good, even though they didn't really think it was good. This is good. Annexation has at least been paused, and put something out of their own on the table. And in fact, and as a result, the kind of cheerleading has really framed the narrative about the agreement. But overall, my position is this is what states do. Clearly, the Israelis and clearly the Emiratis have wanted to normalize relations for their own specific diplomatic, political, and geostrategic reasons. And I don't think there's any, even if there's going to be a fight over the F-35, which I actually don't think there's going to be a huge fight over it. These are what these countries were planning to do for quite some time.
Thanks, Stephen. Jim, I now brought up your latest piece, which is very provocatively titled "Don't Shoot the Messenger," in which you look at the U.S.-Israel deal in light of the many years of polling that you've done of various populations in the region. So summarize for us where Arab publics are with regard to Israel and the prospect of normalization. And based on that, is it your sense that the Palestinian issue is no longer a red line for Arab publics. We often hear that there's a gap between where Arab leaders are and where their publics are. To what extent is that actually the case?
Well, first of all, thank you all for this discussion, and I think Annelle summarized perfectly what the what the gist of the results were. I call the article "Don't Shoot the Messenger" because I've been doing this polling for a while, and when you come up with results that people agree with, it's like, oh, you're the best pollster, you really have your finger on the pulse. And when you come up with numbers that people don't agree with, it's, you know, everything from your methodology to, you know, you're stupid and you just don't understand anything. I've been polling on this for almost 20 years. My brother and I for the first 10, and I've been doing it for the last 10. And we always got certain kinds of numbers that said Palestine is central. I mean, actually, when we put the issue of Palestine in the context of a whole series of domestic issues, you know, healthcare, education, employment, etc., it came out first or second in several countries. It's an emotional issue. I call it the wound in the Arab heart that never heals. And I still think that's the case, except that in this instance, the question was framed around the Israel-Palestine conflict. And we've been polling on that now, using that language for several years. And what we have found is that, of course, it has declined in importance as a critical issue of concern in the foreign policy context, because they're bigger fish to fry. And there's no movement, as Annelle said, and people, in a sense, a kind of resignation and a bit of resentment and a bit of frustration are just saying, I just don't know where to go with this. And so when we got the results in 2019, I was troubled. I mean, I said, these aren't numbers I've ever seen before. What does it mean? So we repolled and we came up with the same numbers. We then followed up with qualitative questions. Why do you say that? And that's what we found. We found people saying, I'm tired of people dying. I'm tired of seeing pictures of mothers crying over their lost children. I'm tired of house demolitions. There's no love lost, incidentally, for Israel in this mix. This is not like, oh, we love Israel. And interestingly enough, Iran is never mentioned as an issue. It was frustration. It was frustration with Palestinian leadership, with no sense of vision, no sense of strategy, no sense of direction. This has been, as she put it, and I think, Annelle, you got it just perfect. This is going nowhere and it's getting worse. Maybe something new has to happen. And one of the tells here was in a question we've asked about where people stand on the Arab Peace Initiative. We give them different options. About 3/4 to 2/3 in most countries continue to support the peace initiative, but an increasing number of that 2/3 to 3/4 say, yes, I support it, but more needs to be done to make it happen. And this issue of normalization is viewed as one thing that might be done to, as people put it in their qualitative responses, to give us more leverage to help Palestinians. Maybe this will give us leverage. So when the ambassador here in Washington, the UAE ambassador, wrote that article for Yediot Ahronot, and when the King of Jordan, King Abdullah, issued his dire threats, and when the EU did sanctions, put them on the table, and US senators and congressmen did some threats of, they're not threats really, but they said that they opposed annexation. We then went back in the field, and we not only polled Arab countries, we polled in Israel as well. And that was the interesting one. Israelis who favored annexation, when reminded of the UAE, Jordan, Europe, and American response, moved the needle by 15 to 20 points from favoring annexation to opposing annexation. And when asked what was the most important concern they had of all Israelis as to why not to annex, the single most important one was, it would alienate Arab countries that we might be able to have a relationship with. So for those who say that Israeli public opinion matters, and for those who say that the UAE did nothing to, stop annexation, if you remember where we were at the end of June, and you look at where public opinion was on this, it had an impact. I think it had an impact. It also was viewed favorably by Arab countries who said, in the countries we polled in, they said that if some countries normalized without peace, would it be desirable? Significant numbers said it would be desirable. And the reasons why are the reasons that we found in 2019. It would create a little more leverage. It would stop the killing. It might move the situation off the dime, and there might be benefits for everybody. And even among Palestinians, where we polled in 2020, about 69% said maybe there'd be some benefits, economic benefits for us as a result of this. So just one last point, if I might. A fear that's always been out there is Iran and Turkey using any step toward normalization to discredit Arab leaders who did it. And with Turkey and Iran's numbers both in the toilet right now, in Arab opinion, it's not a factor. I mean, Syria has sort of the nail in the coffin for both. And so, Turkey railing is not going to move the needle right now in an Arab country, and neither is Iran. So I think it's an interesting situation. I can't talk about the geopolitics of it as Stephen and Annelle are, but I can talk about where opinion is, and opinion is in a very different place. Does it erase the red line? I don't think so. What it does is it recognizes that nothing's moving and something may have to move. Concern is still there for Palestinians. And I dare say that if there were a Palestinian strategy, if there were some movement on the Palestinian sides, a new nonviolent protest movement or something dramatic that happens, I think you'd see Arab opinion moving in a very significant direction toward them. Arabs still care about Palestine. They just don't see the conflict being solved by the status quo.
Thank you. So I want to drill a little deeper in this next round. And Jim, sticking with you on the polling, I'm interested in the evolution of the views in the Arab world. And what you've laid out is very provocative, and I hope people will read the article because it's important and provocative. In terms of the people, with respect to the Palestinians, the Palestinian cause, they still care. It doesn't rate the same level. What about the sort of most sensitive issues, status of Jerusalem, Haram al-Sharif? And I'm also interested in terms of that evolution, listening to the language used by Emiratis in defending the deal, which, when Turkey rails, the answer has been, you normalized years ago. How can you rail about this? And Jordan and Egypt normalized, and there's a certain almost dismissive defensiveness, which I think probably resonates well with the Emirati public. Can you talk about these things a little bit?
Well, as I said, I think that obviously the issues of, if we'd asked the question, how do you feel about Palestinians? We would have gotten a different response than if the way we asked it, which was, how do you feel about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or resolution of the conflict? That's a different thing. One is about people, and the other is about a problem in the context of Syria, the conflict in Yemen, the Arab Spring collapse in several, all of those things are on the front burner because they're roiling. Nothing is happening on the Palestinian front. But as we saw a short while ago, a year or so ago, when trouble emerges at the Haram al-Sharif, you get a reaction in the Arab world. There's no question about that. If there's a new round of devastating violence in Lebanon or in Gaza, you will have a reaction in Arab public opinion. They care about people. They're frustrated that the conflict as a political problem isn't going anywhere. So a distinction should be made, which is why we asked the question, if Israel moves forward with annexation, should the deal be on or off the table? almost 80% in every situation across the board said absolutely terminate. Israel has to be wary right now. So these sort of threats, coded threats at home, well, it's not off the table and we still might do it. And, Netanyahu can play as he wants to. I caution against doing anything because this would blow up, completely blow up. So the issue is not off the table, and I think it's important. And certainly the issue of Jerusalem remains critical. And the UAE will continue to talk about East Jerusalem as the capital, talk about a Palestinian state. I think one thing that I might just say is that while everybody's talking about the two-state solution, I think that what, if anything, this has done is hasten recognition that we're in a one-state world, peace with Egypt, peace with Jordan didn't do anything. This peace isn't going to change the dynamic. There's no way you're getting 650,000 settlers out of the West Bank, and there's no way that you're going to create an independent Palestinian state that's viable and contiguous with 650,000 settlers. And so, if anything, this just moves us in the recognition that we're in a different world here. And maybe if the UAE made a deal, don't annex. If the next Arab country comes along and says, you know what, don't do this, and another makes a deal and says, and don't do that, there could be a way here of creating increased leverage on the Arab side to move Israel off the dime. Certainly peace with Egypt didn't get anything for Palestinians. Peace with Jordan didn't get anything for them. This at least stopped annexation. Maybe additional deals might help move it forward as well. I don't know, but I'm just thinking that there's issues here to consider.
Thanks, and that's a great segue to the question I want to ask Annelle, which is about what really did move the UAE in this specific moment to make this deal, to want to make this deal. And as Jim just said, I mean, the UAE has taken great pains to, even in these past couple of days during the big US-Israel trip to UAE, Emirati leaders talking about supporting a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem. And they continue to reiterate they've gotten assurances that annexation won't go forward, although in the past 24 hours, those assurances have been somewhat watered, or those statements are watered down because they've been challenged on would they walk normalization back if annexation goes forward, and they basically said they wouldn't. But regardless, looking at all of that, is it overly cynical to disbelieve the Emiratis' argument that they truly did this, at least in part, to help the Palestinians, whether by preventing annexation or gaining more leverage, I mean, is that overly cynical as a reading?
I don't think it's overly cynical. I think although, Jim did point out that there was a lot of concern about annexation, the formal date for annexation was supposed to be July 1st, and then sort of nothing happened. And, I think as he mentioned, there was a lot of pushback coming out. Obviously, we had the statement from Ambassador Taiba from the UAE about, directed at Israel of look, don't do this, and obviously also statements from King Abdullah of Jordan and others. So I suspect that annexation was going to be paused anyway. It's, and as Netanyahu has said, it's only a pause. It's not clear how long the pause will be, and I think a lot of it has to do with waiting to see who wins the U.S. election. Essentially, that Netanyahu would not have been in a position to even move forward with annexation in this way if he hadn't gotten so many green lights from the Trump administration. So at this point, he's kind of waiting to see, well, am I going to be facing, more support from a second Trump administration starting next year, or is it going to be a Biden administration, in which case Netanyahu does need to operate a little bit more cautiously. In terms of the calculus from the Emirates, I think Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and the de facto ruler of the UAE, is also very conscious of the upcoming political dynamics with the United States in terms of whether it's Trump or it's Biden, normalizing with Israel plays really well for the American public, and again, really positions the UAE as this sort of unique partner for the United States. Again, going back to the point about the fact that annexation is happening all the time, there was the recent video that came out of the video of the Israeli soldier with his knee on the neck of 64-year-old Palestinian activist Khairi Hanoun, who's protesting settlements in the West Bank, which again, just I think reiterates the fact that although formal annexation is paused, informal annexation continues and the occupation persists. And which again is not just the result of sort of, you know, rabid Zionist settlers, but incentives put in place by the Israeli government that make life easier and more affordable in the settlements than it is in Israel proper, which I think is another important thing to keep in mind. But so just going back to this timing for the UAE, and also something that Jim had mentioned about the fact that Iran is not particularly salient at the moment for Arab publics. You know, I think the world has been observing, you know, the extent to which Iran has sort of failed to contain COVID. Iran seems somewhat weak, and instead we're seeing moves by both Turkey and the UAE kind of positioning themselves in the region. Obviously, we have the current tensions happening in the Eastern Mediterranean between Greece and Turkey, which are bringing in all these additional actors, including, you know, France on the side of Greece and Italy. More, somewhat more, and that in more, it's the breakdown there is more in Libya, that Italy is supporting sort of the Turkish side, supporting the Libyan national government. But just the point being that moving forward, I think this fault line of the UAE positioning itself as a powerful actor throughout the region, and especially in opposition to Turkey, is something that we're going to need to pay greater attention to. And as Jim said, Iran is maybe just not as much of an issue in the region, despite the fact that a lot of these Arab governments continue to sort of beat the drum on the threat from Iran, because they know that that will get the attention of the United States, that our current administration has really blown the threat of Iran out of all proportion. And so anything having to do with Iran, the US is likely to pay attention to. Again, I think that that's likely to shift if we do see a Biden administration and a possible return by the United States to the JCPOA. In which case, again, hopefully the US policy would be able to line up a little bit more with reality in the region and the shifting dynamics there.
Great. And once again, you have set me up for my next question for Stephen. So Stephen, I want to shift looking at the US side of it. And this isn't asking you to take any partisan positions, but as an analyst, how do you assess Donald Trump, his administration, his priorities, his concerns, both foreign and domestic? How do they figure into this story? And how does it figure into the politics as we go into an election season? We're in an election season where you have this UAE deal touted by Trump and company as a great victory of Trump's foreign policy that everyone has to support and celebrate. And Democrats have almost universally celebrated it, treating it as a legitimate foreign policy victory that you know, peace between two countries that weren't actually at war, but still. How do you see this going forward? Is this a new baseline policy, bipartisan, that the next administration, whether it's another Trump administration or a Biden administration, will see greater normalization as a priority in the region? And I'm also interested in your thoughts on how this works with UAE's relationship with Congress, whether we're talking about weapon sales or its activities in Yemen, human rights, Iran.
Right.
Now that the UAE will have Israel in its camp, essentially the way Egypt and Jordan have had it for years, as maybe the main lobbyists for their interests on the Hill.
All right, thanks. Those are really challenging questions, and I just want to start with, I want to start with two different things. One, I want to start with a caveat that I'm not going to get into partisan politics here. Council on Foreign Relations is a strictly nonpartisan organization, so I do policy, not politics, but I will be able to answer your questions. And then the second thing is I just want to back up for a second, because Turkey was mentioned a couple of times, and for those of you who know me, it's right in my wheelhouse here. And you know, Jim mentioned the fact that the Turks have responded poorly to this agreement, and I think that, you know, and Larry, you pointed out that the Emiratis have, you know, pointed out the Turkish hypocrisy in the Turkish railing against the Abraham Accords, and I think there's something very interesting to understand about that. First, President Erdogan is in a weak position domestically. And it does not damage him at all to rail on the Israelis and the United States at home. In fact, that's minting political gold in Turkish politics. And there's also very much a geopolitical aspect to it, because we would be kidding ourselves if the Israelis and the Emiratis, who both look at the demonstration of Turkish power and influence around the region as a threat, that, in part, this accord and part of them coming together is that they see a common set of threats, including Turkey. I think it's important to understand that Erdogan understands that, and that's why he's rallying around. And also, let me just say, I think the Emiratis are absolutely 100% correct when they point out the hypocrisy of the Turks. What is the largest foreign flag carrier at Ben Gurion Airport? Turkish Airlines. Like, El Al doesn't even need to exist. All they need is Turkish Airlines there. There's thousands of Israeli tourists who have enjoyed themselves in Turkey. Commercial relations continue, even intel relations, even despite the fact that the relationship is in a deep freeze, in very specific areas, intel relations continue between Israel and Turkey. So, the Turks obviously want to take this stand for political reasons. Okay, now onto your question about Trump foreign policy. Look, at that event in the Oval Office, the president wanted to present this as something akin to, the signing of the Egypt-Israel peace agreement in March 1979. And I just think it really is something that is manufactured. Again, as we've all agreed, this is something that's a long time in coming. It's not a paradigm shift. What is interesting is that in our current, poisonous, polarized political environment, that most mainstream Democrats and moderate Democrats were willing to get on board with this and say, this is an important step that we support, that the Republican, this is kind of hearkening back to September 10, 2001 American foreign policy, where there was bipartisan support for enlarging the circle of peace as it has been termed over many years. And so this, to them, is, I think, a good step. The idea, I think, among mainstream Democrats and among, if former Vice President Biden was to be elected, is that we can, and this is kind of backing up to the Madrid process, is that we can expand the circle of peace and at the same time work on a resolution to the conflict and a two-state solution, which is, I think, is absurd. The two-state solution is a unicorn that isn't happening. I mean, Jim Zogby and I are in the exact same place on this. The two-state solution, there's a one-state reality, but nevertheless, I think that that is what is going to be the policy, because that has been the framing of this issue. I don't imagine that the Biden administration is going to get too tough with the Israelis. That's not a knock on anybody. That's not a partisan statement. That's just an objective observation of what seems to be the case. Even if the Israelis had moved forward with actual formal annexation, not the annexation that goes on without actually declaring it, which is what the Israelis have been doing for all of these years, I think that a Biden administration or a Trump administration would not have all that much to say about it. So yes, this is the baseline policy, normalization. Whether it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration, there'll be encouragement to the Bahrainis, there'll be encouragement to the Omanis, there'll be encouragement to the Moroccans, to the Sudanese, anybody who's kind of even looked in this direction, there will be encouragement of it, while at the same time saying, we will work on the two-state solution. And the Trump people will say we have the Trump plan for peace, which really isn't a plan. But that is, I think, the baseline policy, and that's what we should be prepared for. I think in terms of the Emiratis with Congress, this is, a huge win for them. One, it separates them from the Saudis, who've been mum. They are, on the team. Like I said, there is broad support for this agreement. As Annelle pointed out, the Emiratis separate themselves out from the region and saying, we are unique. We are tolerant. We've hosted the Pope. We are building the most expensive synagogue in the world. There are pictures of Jews carrying Torahs in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. I'm not criticizing those things. Whatever the motivation is, those are actually good things. I'd rather see those things. I'd rather run into the chief rabbi in Washington's largest Reform synagogue in the airport in Abu Dhabi than not. But they are holding themselves out, and I think it's a big win. You are not seeing a kind of revulsion to the idea of supplying the Emiratis with advanced weaponry that you might otherwise see, given Yemen, given shenanigans with Qatar, given the shenanigans in Libya, and so on and so forth. This is a big deal. And it reminds me of a conversation I had with a one-time vice president of Egypt, a guy named Ismail Sabri Abdullah, who said, Sadat understood that if you want to have good relations with the United States, especially the Congress, you needed to spend the night in Tel Aviv. Now that's sort of I'm not putting it's a crude representation, but there is a certain trilateral logic to these relationships. And clearly the Emiratis understand this.
Thanks, Steve. If it's all right, I'm going to stick with you. You mentioned advanced weaponry, and we've seen the controversy and tensions around the F-35 deal. So while maybe folks in Washington aren't, don't see providing F-35s to the UAE as controversial, clearly the Israeli government does. So to what extent is this, is this a bump in the road that is easy to overcome, or is this something bigger that could actually derail the whole process of normalization? And do you see, do you see a way to offset? How do you see the Israelis responding to that sale? Is it something that Washington will simply up the ante and compensate Israelis with even more hardware?
Yes, I think this is basically political theater that Netanyahu and others need to go through. But there is a strain of thought. You see Israeli officials saying, not one screw of the F-35 for the Emiratis. Like I said, this is political theater of all political theater. By the way, I should point out, it's not just the F-35, it's also armed drones. It's kind of upgraded intel sharing and a variety of other things. I think ultimately what's going to happen is this. Keep in mind that there are going to be different variants of the F-35. There are planes that they sit next to each other. They say F-35 on them, but they have different capabilities. So the Israelis are clearly upping the ante. They will get some other variant of the F-35 that is more capable. They will get other stuff piled onto them that has been on their wish list, that they will suddenly, miraculously, that wish list will be fulfilled, and so on and so forth. There's also a strain of thought that through the political theater that's happening in Israel, where the Israelis are like, we need to talk about this, that, look, there wasn't this firestorm when the Turks were supposed to get F-35, and that the Israeli government has actually identified Turkey as a hostile state. You can't really argue that the UAE is a hostile state in any kind of serious way. So ultimately, they're going to get down to business. The Israelis are going to get, quote unquote, compensated. They're upping the ante for what they want. And the Emiratis will ultimately get the F-35 and other things. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be, because it's going to be played out in the press, because the Israelis have their politics. And there's going to be some politics with the Trump administration, because they're going to want to say, hey, we're selling all these wonderful, beautiful weapons to the region. But I expect, and maybe I'm an outlier in Washington on this, I expect that the Emiratis will get the F-35. This will not be a bump in the road to normalization. And in the end, the Israeli government and the Emirati government will be very happy with whatever packages that they get and are compensated for in this deal.
Great, thanks. Jim, I wanted to ask you about, we often hear that one upside to this new arrangement is that the UAE and maybe other future Gulf states that choose to normalize will gain some leverage over Israel. How valid do you think that argument is, given this very thin line that we see between daily kind of de facto annexation and de jure annexation? I think de jure annexation clearly is a threat in terms of people who still cling to the two-state solution. But in terms of realities on the ground, there isn't a huge amount of difference. At least one could argue that. Do you see a way for this deal to provide leverage to the UAE, for example, on red line issues like building in E1 area between Ma'ale Adumim and Jerusalem, or Givat Hamatos, these settlement areas that are seen as the nail in the coffin of the prospect of two states? Can you imagine that the UAE sort of stalling its normalization process in order to leverage any of those issues?
Well, let's just start with where we are in terms of where we've been over the last 50 years or more. The Arab League boycott made no difference. Peace with Egypt made no difference. Peace deal with Jordan made no difference. There have been successive efforts at creating settlement freezes, made no difference. In the sense that you could have every Arab country but Egypt and Jordan continuing to not normalize, and annexation was continuing, the de facto annexation was continuing apace. Didn't make a difference. This might make a difference, is what people perceive. And this and the promise of more might make a difference. It creates a sense that don't screw up what we already got going. Now, does that change the situation for Palestinians on the ground? And the answer is no, because Israel has operated with impunity. And that impunity is something that needs to be, of course, acknowledged. But does it, look, as long as more than half the people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea are Arab, this problem is not going away and requires a solution. The Israelis have just, over the last several years, solidified the fact that this solution will not be two states, but it will be a Palestinian majority in a one state. I mean, that's the situation. And we're finding that playing out in opinion as well. So how will the US react? How will Arab countries react if Israel does something stupid? They very well might do something stupid, but whether or not, and I disagree with this a little bit, Stephen, that Biden wouldn't do anything. He might not want to do anything, but public opinion in the US, where we've also polled, has also significantly changed on these issues. I mean, Israel, the fact that AIPAC gave permission to members of Congress to oppose annexation, but don't go any further, meant that, like the little Dutch boy and the leak in the dike, I mean, this thing is collapsing around them. They cannot control the debate on the Democratic side. It's not just, as I note in the polling, there's not just a partisan divide, there's a demographic divide on this issue that's as big as the demographic divide used to be on gay marriage, with Democrats 2/3, 1/3 on one side, Republicans 1/3, 2/3 on the other side. And the reality on the Democratic side is that you have members of Congress moving now because they're feeling incredible pressure to move. And would a Biden administration feel that pressure from Congress? Absolutely. So if Israel were to take steps like E1 and there were a Palestinian response, if they were to take steps in Jerusalem proper and there were a Palestinian response, or if there just were a Palestinian response, period, and Israel were to react negatively, you would find pressure from Congress different than we've seen in the past, and the Biden administration would have to react, and the Arab world would have to react as well. So there are today, I think, some unique pressures on Israel that did not exist prior to this current period, and the UAE deal, far from closing off those pressures, simply adds a new little wrinkle to the pressures, and that is, you don't want to screw this one up, and you don't want to screw up the ones that may come after it. So I think we'll have to wait and see, but as far as the way opinion is playing out in Israel proper, in among Arabs in the Arab world and how it's playing out here in the U.S. has created, I think, a different context for this issue as it unfolds going forward.
Great, thanks, Jim. And now I wanted to ask you about Saudi Arabia, which is obviously a key player in the region, arguably the most important Arab state strategically. Why aren't the Saudis jumping on board? They clearly, I mean, it seems pretty clear that they signed off on this, that they're okay with it, but they haven't gone sort of whole hog, so to speak, in terms of normalization. So talk to us a little bit about why you think that's the case, what it might take for the Saudis to normalize with Israel. But I want to tack on to that a question from our audience that I think is related, which has to do with Qatar, which is another important Gulf state that has had sort of under the table relations with Israel for a long time, that has a pretty important role in terms of the situation in Gaza, playing a key mediating role just this week in de-escalating that situation there, but with a very different set of alliances and priorities in the region than the UAE has. So if you could talk to us about the role that these, both the Saudis and the Qataris play, given things like the UAE-Qatari rivalry, which is on the wrong side of the UAE alliance with other regional states.
Yeah, I'll first talk about the issue of Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, in general, I think Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, would love to normalize. That would sort of play into his whole narrative of himself as this transformational leader and a reformer, which obviously suffered a major setback with, after his sort of charm tour of the United States and his announcement, permitting women to drive and opening cinemas and all these ways in which MBS had been trying to really show that he was taking Saudi Arabia into the future. Obviously, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi 2 years ago this October really brought that sort of shining image crashing down around his ears, and he's been trying since then to get back to that sort of receptiveness to him as this new leader. And so normalizing with Israel would be a great way to do that. At the same time, so things are not easy at the moment in Saudi Arabia. I mean, not only under conditions of COVID, obviously, that the whole world is facing, but also Saudi Arabia is in a difficult transition at the moment. Mohammed bin Salman is in the process of trying to implement his various reforms under Vision 2030, one of which was the introduction of a value-added tax for the first time in 2018 of 5%, which was tripled to 15% in July. Various ways in which the Saudi state is cutting benefits for citizens, just making life harder in Saudi Arabia at the moment. At the same time, if and when Mohammed bin Salman comes to power, following his father, ostensibly the death of his father, King Salman, that would be the first time that a Saudi king is not a son of the founder, King Abdulaziz Al Saud, which is a potentially destabilizing moment. And so Mohammed bin Salman is doing everything he can right now to try to consolidate his control, and normalizing relations with Israel right now would be the exact opposite of that. That would provoke potentially massive backlash, despite MBS's demonstrated willingness to go after dissidents, not only obviously Khashoggi, but many prisoners of conscience in jail. Speaking with friends in Saudi Arabia, I know that they no longer feel that even expressing criticism of Israel is permitted, in a way that historically, if not only in Saudi Arabia, but elsewhere in the region, sort of frustration against one's own ruler wasn't really permitted, but one could complain about Israel, that was sort of the permitted avenue for expression of dissatisfaction. And now that that's no longer permitted, especially in Saudi Arabia, but also elsewhere, like in the UAE, the question then arises, where else that frustration will be directed. the issue of one other thing on Saudi Arabia, which you didn't ask about, but another possible sweetener would be Saudi control of the Holy Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, which is currently controlled by the Wizarat al-Awqaf, the Ministry of Religious Affairs of Jordan under King Abdullah, partly due to his status as a descendant of the Hashemites who formerly controlled Mecca and Medina, the two holy sites, now in the territory of Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudi leadership would love to be able to say they control all three of the holiest sites in Islam, Mecca, Medina, and the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem, including the Al-Aqsa complex with the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. However, if the US and Israel were to grant Saudi Arabia control of those spaces, this would lead to even further public backlash, especially from Jordan, which is already struggling to contain its refugees, its large Palestinian population, Iraqi refugees, Syrian refugees, the various waves of refugees that we've seen kind of across the region in the past 10 years following the conflicts arising in 2011. Many of those people are housed in Jordan, and so the instability that would result if Israel were to take away control from Jordan and give it to Saudi Arabia is another factor that I'm sure is giving pause to all of the actors involved. To the question of Qatar, obviously, Qatar, sort of the fact that Qatar has these de facto relationships with Israel, as you said, is a crucial player in maintaining any semblance of stability and survival in Gaza. And as you said, they're a key broker in this recent deal with Hamas to try to sort of settle down instability in Gaza. Qatar, under different circumstances, would probably be willing to normalize with Israel. But at the moment, they, although they have this sort of de facto securitized relationship, they're unlikely to move forward with normalization because, again, that would sort of put them on the wrong side in terms of their messaging, that right now they are holding themselves out as sort of standing up for the Palestinians, and they claim to sort of be in favor of democratic movements in the region, although again that's not really borne out by reality. The Qataris, like the Emiratis, like all the Arab monarchs, are interested in their own stability, and they'll do whatever it takes to try to preserve that. I think one issue just to keep in mind in terms of thinking about the Arab monarchs, which is something that someone brought up in the questions, is the possibility that Israel moving forward is going to sort of take over control or take responsibility for the security of these Arab states in the context of a smaller and smaller role for the United States, which I think is something that we are likely to see moving forward, even if it's not official normalization as the UAE has pursued, but just a further deepening of these de facto relationships moving forward.
Thanks, Annelle. And if I could follow up, we have, I think, time for one more round. Follow up for just quick question for you. The issue has come up a couple times already about other states following suit or not, right? So when the initial announcement came out of normalization, it was announced, we had this flurry of reports about imminent normalization announcements from other states, none of which have panned out. Can you talk a little bit about that? What is likely on the way, why we're not seeing this pan out more quickly, and what you would anticipate seeing as an observer?
Right. So, right, as we've talked about, there was this idea that was going to happen, and yet it has not. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the UAE, it is, although it posits itself as unique, it is in fact unique. It has a tiny population. It is essentially a police state. The population there is very much controlled. And so even members, Emirati citizens who oppose normalization would feel very uncomfortable saying so at this moment. Whereas, other states like Saudi Arabia, like Oman, for example, like Bahrain, these are places where we have seen, well, more in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, we have seen expressions of discontent historically. And so there is more of this possibility for dissatisfaction. I think Oman, is currently dealing with a major financial crisis, obviously exacerbated by COVID. And there was this notion that maybe Oman would move forward. I mean, historically, Oman was one of the kind of early movers in making outreaches to Israel, was one of the first Arab countries to have an Israeli prime minister, for example, come to visit the Omani territory. But we saw, for example, statements from the Grand Mufti of Oman, for example, coming on Twitter and saying, just opposition to any kind of normalization. So again, I think it really boils down to which Arab leaders think that they can get away with it, that they have their populations under sufficient control, that they wouldn't face such a level of backlash that it would be destabilizing. But again, as I said, I think moving forward, we're just going to continue to see a further deepening of relations with Israel. Again, even if it's not publicly acknowledged, these relationships already exist. I mean, Stephen pointed this out very clearly earlier. And so these various countries that have been named as likely candidates, Bahrain, Oman, Sudan, Morocco, and Qatar moving forward, are likely to further develop their relationships with Israel and move towards this sort of de facto normalization, which again, I suspect is partly motivated by the extent to which these actors do see an increasingly diminished role for the United States in the region militarily, and moving hopefully towards what will be a more regionally directed security architecture. I mean, the hope would be that this would be inclusive, that it would also include Iran, for example, that the Emiratis and the Saudis would be able to overcome the current rift and their blockade of Qatar. And that moving forward, they'll all understand that it is in their mutual interest to sort of end these internal or these small sort of proxy wars against each other, and recognize the extent to which they'll all be more stable if they take responsibility for their own security, again, in the absence of kind of the strong US military presence that they've historically relied on.
Thank you. And that's another good segue. So Stephen, I want to talk to you about some of the tensions or frictions that might arise. For example, Israel for years has had a peace treaty with Jordan. It's not a particularly warm treaty, but it is a stable treaty, which has afforded Israel lots of security benefits. Does moving forward with normalization with Gulf states, which is normalization in the interest of continued de facto annexation, if not de jure, how does that challenge a peace treaty with Jordan, particularly if we move towards a stronger role for, say, Saudi Arabia on the Temple Mount, for example? Or for instance, what we see with Qatar's role in Gaza, which is, Qatar and Israel have a relationship in managing Gaza. At the same time, the United Arab Emirates has an active lobby campaign in Washington targeting Gaza and Turkey, or targeting Qatar and Turkey. So how does this move? Is Israel looking sort of in the direction now of sacrificing the relationships it has already built on one public track of normalization in favor of a new kind of normalization with the Gulf? Or do they somehow manage to balance all of this?
Yes, they are willing to sacrifice it. I just want to back up for 1 second, and I have a comment, just a quick comment on Annelle's last point. And I think it's a good point about, as the United States kind of reduces or withdraws in some way, that, the states in the region, there'll be a regional directed security architecture, I think is the way. But of course, I'm also much older than Annelle. And I actually don't see that happening. What concerns me is the ability of the Israelis and the Emiratis to make mischief in the region, along with the Saudis and the Bahrainis and everybody else. So I don't see them getting together with the Iranians, and I don't see them, whatever regional security architecture comes about, I think it's going to be one that may, and I think is more likely to sow more instability in the region. Anyway, to your question, I do think, I was part of actually a rather extraordinary, very small meeting with a number of Jordanians and Americans pre-COVID, where the Jordanians were here to say, help us save this. We were part of the normalization, and we think the peace treaty is a good treaty for Jordan. Americans need to help us save this treaty. And I think it's because the Israelis have sort of overlooked the Jordanian relationship. They, see Jordan and that and the king as obviously important. But if you're going to expand your relations not only to the UAE but also to the Saudis, that is really the kind of big enchilada for them, is to have that. And if you have the Saudis and the Emiratis and possibly the Omanis, and you've been, dancing around with the Qataris, suddenly the Jordanians don't seem as important, in addition to the fact when that intersects with the idea of annexation and the fact that Jordan as Palestine has come back on the radar screen. It's not a mainstream position in Israel, but that Jordan is Palestine, and won't that solve everything and everybody can have their own peace, is something that I think when I think about Jordan, it's that cascade of events where the Israelis don't care as much because they're normalizing with countries of the region, and because they haven't given up on annexation, even though they're not going to declare it on a specific date, what effect that has on stability in Jordan, and what that really means, and that it's not as meaningful for the Israelis any longer, given the fact that there's a one-state reality, and that annexation continues. One of the things that I think is important about the accord between the UAE and Israel is that, as I said in my opening remarks, it does throw down a marker that at least theoretically folks should take up, whether it's the PA or the Jordanians who are worried about this stuff, and try to deal with this in a constructive way. One of the things that the UAE deal does is it holds the potential of moving Netanyahu away from almost exclusive reliance on the Yesha Council. Did I pronounce that correctly? The Yesha Council. And as the circle of peace widens, what he's been telling Israelis, and what
we should
Israelis
tell
are
people
experiencing.
the Yesha Council is the Council of Judea and Samaria settlements. It's the overarching
settlers,
umbrella.
The settlers. Yeah. That there's the potential to move him more in a direction of where more Israelis are. Not that they care so much about the West Bank, but at least that's the point. And it could be beneficial to the Jordanians. But without that, I think the Israelis have really kind of, it's not as important to them as it once was. That's my read of the situation.
Thanks. And Jim, I think you're going to get the last word here. So let's talk about what the reaction in the region will be to further normalization if it continues forward. And here we're talking about whether we're talking about more states establishing open ties with Israel, or more in-your-face expansion of UAE-Israel relations, which it looks like we're going to have. I mean, UAE is an Arab state. It has people from all over the region traveling through it normally, not COVID times. And now there's going to be Israelis there to meet them, which, by the way, has been raised by some Israelis as a security issue. How does Israel maintain the security of its citizens in this complicated world? How does this play out? And there are a couple questions from the audience about the generational differences. When you look at polling, the demographics of the polling, do you see different attitudes from based on age, attitudes towards the Palestinians, attitudes towards normalization, when you look at the age of people in a region which has a huge cohort of young people? So if you can talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, let's do the age one first. I can put that one to bed quickly. We see very little age difference. We see very little gender difference. I think people want to think that there are these differences. We just don't find them. We find that there are differences. Sometimes there are differences based on income. So a lot of times differences based on education. Sometimes it's multiple variables, like if your mother and father were educated, you'll have a different view than someone whose parents aren't educated. But we don't find per se young, old, big split on most questions, nor do we find a gender split. On the question of other countries normalizing, let me start with Saudi Arabia, because Annelle talked about that. When we ask the question, how desirable is it No, we asked the question first, do you believe that some countries might normalize without peace? They answer. Then we say, how desirable would it be if some countries were to? And then we get the answer. The question is framed some countries. It's never quite framed your country. And I think that if it were framed your country, I'd get very different answers. And I'd get very different answers, in particular in Saudi Arabia. And I'd get different answers if I polled across the Arab world about Saudi Arabia, because when we've polled about other countries in Arab countries, their views of them, Saudi Arabia is viewed in a very special way. It is the place of it's Mecca, and it's the home of the Prophet. It's sacred territory, and that resonates deeply across the Arab world. Its favorables across the Arab world are largely a function of its religious dimension. UAE's favorables across the region are largely a function of the fact, as I described it I've written about all of these different countries. UAE is seen as, by other Arabs, in the way that Europeans viewed America turn of the last century. Streets are paved in gold. If you have a dream, it's the place you want to go to realize it. And in fact, if you're a young, enterprising Lebanese or Syrian tech guy, where do you go to get a startup? You go to Dubai, and that has been the place where dreams get realized, and that has resonated. Qatar's image is a creation of its TV. I mean, it plays a larger than life role in the region because its image is projected through its media. And Egypt has a historical, all these countries, in other words, have images that exist, but Saudi Arabia is religious, almost exclusively religious, and people focus on that a lot. So I don't expect Saudi to want to threaten or challenge that image anytime soon. And I think that folks are right about UAE since the time of Sheikh Zayed, right? I mean, Sheikh Zayed created a different image for the country, and that is still playing out in several ways. So, as I think it was Stephen who mentioned, the issues of tolerance. I was there when the Pope came. My wife and I went to see the Pope. It was an historic moment. Remember, UAE is a Wahhabi country on the Arabian Peninsula, and they welcomed the Pope for a mass that drew well over 100,000 and had members of the ruling family on the altar with the clergy who were there. It was a kind of sending a very different message. Now, how that plays out going forward, now that they have a normalized relationship with Israel, I think we'll have to wait and see. But I would suggest that no one should not expect that we'll see Israelis traveling. No one should not expect that we'll see an embassy at some point. But I think we should also not expect Israel to be stupid and do something to threaten that, because it will compromise. They're in a vulnerable position right now. Israel is, and they've operated with impunity, and now they got to watch their P's and Q's. I mean, they're kind of like at the party, and they've been the bad boy in the neighborhood, but if they act stupid, they might get disinvited, or they won't get invited to anybody else's party. And I think that that's something that they have to be careful of. So I think that interestingly enough, I mean, Egypt paid a price of exclusion from the Arab consensus for a long time. I mean, the Arab League moved to Tunisia. Egyptians were uninvited from things. They're back in the fold. Actually, nothing changed. Jordan made a peace agreement in the context of what was happening with Oslo. And I always argue that the Palestinians opened the door for Israel to the rest of the Arab world, and Israel closed the door behind them. They went in first and closed the door, and Palestinians got locked out of this. I mean, even at the Oman Economic Summit that was called to promote economy in the West Bank, Palestinian businessmen were not allowed to go to Oman to that summit. I was there, and it was shocking. This is going to bring Israelis into the context of the Arab world. They're going to have to behave. They can't They can't be stupid. And I think that it remains to be seen whether they are or not. It also remains to be seen whether or not Palestinians themselves take an initiative to bring their issue back to the front burner in a creative and constructive way that has a vision and a strategy to put themselves out there. That would be my hope. That would be, I think, the need. And I think Arabs would respond to it rather significantly. But we've been absent that. I mean, this has been basically a survival game with no forward-looking vision for way too many years now. I'll leave it there. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the poll. It's and I also appreciate the fact that the messenger didn't get shot. So I'm still around. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you on behalf of FMEP and MEI to all of our panelists, Stephen Cook, Annelle Sheline, and Jim Zogby. Thank you, guys. And thank you all for joining us in our audience. If you want to learn more about the issues that we've been discussing yesterday and today, you can check out the websites for today's webinars. And also, I would encourage you to check out the social media and especially Twitter handles of our panelists and of FMEP and MEI, and also check out our website. Check back at MEI and FMEP websites for recordings of this webinar and further resources on this topic. As Laura noted earlier, today's webinar is part 1 of a 2-part series, looking at the implications of the Israel-UAE. Part two, excuse me. Today's webinar is part 2 in a 2-part series. So that wraps up our webinar. Again, you can find us at mei.edu and fmep.org. Thank you all.